What was Gideon's father's response to the people who complained that Baal's altar had been destroyed? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Judges on Walking Through the Bible.
Glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing Judges 6 verses 28 to 32, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Judges chapter 6 verse 28, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Judges chapter 6, beginning at verse 28. And when the men of the city arose early in the morning, there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image that was beside it was cut down, and the second bull was being offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, "Who has done this thing?" And when they had inquired and asked, they said, "Gideon the son of Joash has done this thing." Then the men of the city said to Joash, "Bring out your son, that he may die, because he has torn down the altar of Baal, and because he has cut down the wooden image that was beside it." But Joash said to those who stood against him, "Would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down." Therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, "Let Baal plead against him, because he has torn down his altar." Over the last two lessons, we've been introduced to Israel's fifth judge, the man Gideon. When we find Gideon, he's described as a man of valor, yet when the Lord tells him to go and fight Midian, for he would be with him, Gideon doesn't act like a man of valor at all. He gives excuses as to why he would be chosen, seeing as how his family is the least in Manasseh, and him personally is the least in his particular family. He also wondered out loud how the Lord could possibly be with him, seeing as all the calamity that had been befallen Israel. The Lord wouldn't take no for an answer and said that he would in fact be with Gideon, and that he was going to go and fight Midian. Now, Gideon had been satisfied that it was in fact the Lord speaking to him, because Gideon had seen that sign. So God told Gideon to go and destroy the altar of Baal that his father had, as well as the image that lay beside it, and erect an altar to him. He would use the wood from the image he had just torn down to offer a bullock as a sacrifice to God. Now Gideon was still fearful in spite of all this, so instead of destroying the altar during the day, where he might face resistance from his father's household and the people of the city, Gideon, along with 10 of his servants, decided to destroy the altar and image by night. With the deed done, Gideon offered the sacrifice just as the Lord commanded. Now, when we read that Gideon offered the sacrifice, we can easily assume that the sacrifice was completely burned and the offering over. But let's remember, what was being burned was a bull. God was not sending fire down from heaven to consume this animal. It was going to take a while to burn. And so, while the altar would have been taken down during the night and a new one erected, it is likely that this sacrifice was offered closer to morning. And because of that, it was still burning when the men of the city arose early in the morning. Now I can only imagine waking up to the smell of burning bull and wondering what was going on, which is exactly the reaction that the men of the city had. They saw that the altar of Baal had been torn down and the wooden image cut down, and this bull being offered upon another altar that was built, and so naturally asked the question, who did this? Now you might be thinking, well, where was Gideon? Well, the text doesn't say. I don't think it would be unfair to say that Gideon was probably sleeping, having worked all night. When it was told to the men, probably by some of the servants of Gideon who helped, that it was Gideon who was responsible, they called for Joash and told him to bring his son out that he may die for tearing down the altar of Baal. I find it interesting that they called for Joash, not for Gideon, who would have been an adult by now, because that would be foreign to today's society. But that was not foreign to this culture, which was very patriarchal. A father, while he was still alive, was still responsible to answer for the actions of his children, even if his children were adults. Now Joash, whose altar it was who was torn down by his son, could have delivered his son to the men to be put to death, but he didn't do that. Instead, he stood against these men and said that the one who would plead for Baal by killing his son would be put to death himself. If Baal is a god, let him plead or avenge himself. This shows us a change in the attitude of Joash. Before he was an idol worshiper, but now that Gideon had done what he did, an act of courage, he was going to stand behind his son's actions. If Baal was God, Gideon would be killed, but not at the hands of the men of the city, but at the hands of Baal himself. Of course, Baal didn't kill Gideon because Baal isn't God. He's a false god devised by the Canaanites. Gideon was thus called Jerubbaal, which means let Baal fight or plead, because Gideon tore down Baal's altar. This surname very soon became an honorable title for Gideon. How? Well, when it became apparent to the people that Baal could not do any harm, Jerubbaal became a Baal fighter, one who had fought against Baal. Later on in the Old Testament, instead of Jerubbaal, we find the name Jerubbesheth, in which Besheth equals Bosheth, a nickname for Baal. This occurs in other Hebrew names, such as Isbosheth and Eshbaal, referring to the same person. With Gideon having obeyed the command of the Lord and removed the altar of Baal in his father's household, now was the time for Gideon to deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. We'll begin to see that happen, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Judges chapter 6, verses 33 to 40, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.